Welcome to your first lecture from AP Art History. We are going to be talking about the prehistoric world today. Now, prehistory, when it comes to art, goes way back. We really could be even talking about as far back as what's known as the Lower Paleolithic. Paleolithic is a term that means old stone. And the Paleolithic period is where we see the first stone tools, and we really see mankind. We see the origins of mankind as it begins to develop societies and to become really much more complex and sophisticated. Now, Paleolithic is broken into a series of different periods. You have the Lower Paleolithic, the Middle Paleolithic, and finally the Upper Paleolithic. Now, our course of study and our focus is really going to be on the Upper Paleolithic. During the Upper Paleolithic, this is the first time we begin to see people really make art. The Upper Paleolithic dates from about 30,000 to about 8,000 BCE. That's before the Common Era. And during this period in history, we find the first creations of ceramics, textiles, the first representations of people or animals, and also really the first systems of personal belief and ornament and graphical representations and other much more complex behaviors that we see that are indicative of a more complicated society. Now, we will also be talking about something called the Neolithic period. Now, Neolithic means new stone. Now, both of these, the Paleolithic and the Neolithic, are periods within prehistory. And that means before history, before writing. And the Neolithic period dates roughly from 8,000 to 2000 BCE. And this is a really hard time frame to pin down because it depends upon where you are. Neolithic is not about really a specific chronology. It's about technology. It has to do with what people were doing and what they knew how to do and really how their societies developed. So Paleolithic, you're a hunter-gatherer, is what it comes down to. There's also something called the Mezzo Lithic, the Middle Stone Age. We don't talk about that one quite as much, but the Middle Stone Age is a transitional period. People are making changes in their technology and developing new things. During the Neolithic, though, what happens is people become agrarian societies. You have the creation of agriculture, you have animal husbandry, and you also have permanent housing. Those three things are really the foundation of the Neolithic period. And because that happens at different times, in different places, with different societies, this is a chronology that we have to kind of be a little flexible with. It depends upon where you are, really. If we're talking about the cradle of civilization, the Near East, then yeah, we're talking about 8,000 to 2000 BCE. But that differs if we're talking about other places in the world. So we'll be looking at artworks that come from Africa, some of the earliest things we see, from France, from other places within Europe. We'll also be looking around the world. Mankind did, of course, originate in Africa, and we see some of the earliest hominid fossils there. We see the earliest evolution of man there, and we also see some of the earliest intentionally manufactured objects or made by people as what we today would refer to as art. So one of the earliest objects that we'll be looking at here from Africa is an object that came from a cave called the Apollo 11 cave in Nambia. And this was discovered by anthropologists who were excavating and discovered this object, and it's actually created with charcoal drawn on stone. Fairly simplistic process. But it's a very, very early representation of an animal. Now, we're not entirely sure what kind of animal it is. It's referred to as the animal facing left, a very creative name, obviously. But there were several fragments of stone that were found with these plaques and paint, and some of these had recognizable images of animals. Now, we don't again know what animal species was rendered necessarily, but someone took great care to create these. It's also quite notable that these are done on pieces of stone that could have been moved and carried. And this is what we call portable art. This is art that someone could have picked up and carried around with them. And one of the things that's really indicative of this, that this tells us, is that this is a society that didn't necessarily live in one given location all the time. They were mobile. They were probably a hunter-gatherer society, and so objects like this had to be portable. And that's something that we see really quite commonly when we're looking at early forms of art. So another important thing that we'll bring up here when we're talking about this particular object is a term, a vocabulary term, in fact. So a term here is schematic, and schematic refers to images that are objects that are simplified drawings or other art forms that are used to symbolize a form through standardized approximations. Now, I understand that that is a mouthful, But to kind of summarize, explain what that really means is, you think about when you're a little kid and you draw a house. Everyone draws the same little box, the triangle on top, and a little chimney. And nobody's house looks like that. But it's a schematic. It's a representation, a standard approximation of what a house looks like. And so this is a standardized approximation, a schematic, for a woman. It's not intended to represent any one given specific person, but again, more than likely was representative of the concept of fertility. So another example that we can look at here of the same basic concept is a woman holding a bison horn. And this is from Dodon in France and dates to roughly 25,000 to 20,000 BCE. Now this was originally painted, you can't really tell now, but it's painted and carved limestone. It's only about 1 foot 6 inches in height. It's quite small. And it's also been disassociated from its original context. This was actually chiseled onto a much larger piece of stone, a massive stone block in front of a Neolithic shelter instead of basically a place people would live, and painted with a red ochre. But one of the things that's interesting if we look at this is, again, we have this emphasis on concepts of things that relate to fertility. Even today, when we see images of a horn, often a horn that has food kind of pouring out of it, a cornucopia, for us that represents the concept of plenty, of harvest. And so that probably is the same concept here. It's a very old concept. But you'll also note here that we again see the same emphasis on features that tie in with fertility, with fecundity and abundance, and yet the facial features are exceptionally minimal. They're not important in this case. Another vocabulary term here that we would bring up at this point is the term relief. Now, this basically refers to a sculpture that's intended to only be viewed from one side. It's usually carved into a wall or into a very large block of stone, and again, they're not intended to be viewed in the round. You don't walk around it, you just look at it basically from a single angle. Now, while our last example was subtractive, carved into the wall, this is an example of additive sculpture. Now, additive means it's built up. So rather than carving into an object, you're building. Now, subtractive sculpture is generally done with materials like stone and wood, etc., whereas additive sculpture is most commonly done with clay. And so this is a process of building up surfaces. Now, these bison that we see here, these were modeled by someone out of clay about somewhere between 15 and 10,000 years ago. They're about 2 foot long each, and the cracks that you see in the surface actually probably occurred very, very shortly after their creation, as the clay dried. And there's some really interesting things about these two. But first off, we can see that they're really quite naturalistic. You have this very well represented image of a bison. We can recognize what they are. We also have some ideas of the types of tools that were used based upon the marks in the clay. And here's one thing that's really quite interesting. There's actually even little details, fine details that are added into the surface, and we can tell they were done by the artist's fingers. And there's actually still finger marks. You can see the original finger marks in the clay that date back, 15,000 years, which is really quite remarkable. So there's lots of really famous examples that we can talk about when it comes to Paleolithic art. But probably the best known, the most famous example I think that we can talk about is the cave of Lascaux, which is in France. Lascaux is really well known for some of the beautiful painted galleries inside. Lascaux is really quite remarkable. Probably the best known section of Lascaux is a large area gallery, circular gallery, which is called the Hall of the Bulls. Now, not all of the species depicted in there are bulls, but there are quite a few bulls. And also, it's quite interesting is that many of them vary in size. Some of them are outline only, whereas some of them are fully painted. And this raises some really interesting questions about this cave, by the way. And this isn't the only decorated area. There's an area called the Shaft of the Deadman. We'll take a look at that. The Chamber of the Felines. There's the Chamber of Engraving. So all throughout this really quite large cave, there are, in fact, some really astounding works of art that date back, of course, as we're talking about here, back to the Upper Paleolithic period. So here we have an image of one of the best known rooms within the cave of Lascaux. This is the Hall of the Bulls, looking at the left wall. And if we look there, we can see these images of animals, and they appear to almost be on a ground line. That's really just basically part of the natural strata of the cave. And if you look a little higher up, you'll see some of the animals do appear to be floating. And again, many of these are bulls, but not all of them. To give you an idea on scale, the largest of the bulls, and you can see one kind of on the right-hand side that's mostly silhouetted, is about 11 foot 6 inches in length, so really quite large. Now, it almost gives us an image here. When you look at this now, you almost get this impression of a moving herd. And I think that some people have made the mistake of assuming that this was all part of one big composition representing a landscape of all these different animals. But there's some really kind of interesting things going on here. We can tell by looking at these that some of these animals were done at the same time, probably by the same artist, but then others were definitely done by a different hand and in a very different style, and probably at a very different time. Some of the animals overlap each other, they seem to share space, and this really implies some interesting possibilities. Is this part of some sort of a ritual process? Is it sympathetic magic, part of an idea about hunting? You know, basically by creating an image of the animal, do you weaken its spirit and make it easier for you to hunt this animal? Is it an instructional tool? Insert spear here. You know, we really don't know. Some people have even suggested these could be images that represent deity figures and may represent a much more complicated religion. One of your tasks with this unit in class will be to read some articles that really delve into these issues and to engage in a discussion with your peers about what the possible ramifications of these images really are. What could they represent? What could they mean? What could they really tell us about these people and what they believed in? So here's a key image for you from the Hall of the Bulls. And again, here you can see this sense of overlapping imagery. You can see a bull, you can see what appears to be a horse or an auroch. We don't really know exactly what some of these animals are, because of course we're dealing with, again, key term here, schematic representations. But one of the things that is kind of interesting is the use of something called twisted perspective. If you look at these, you'll notice that the animals are represented in a combination of frontal and profile view. For example, the horns seem to be in a three-quarter or almost a frontal view. Now, if you really saw a bull in this posture, the horns would be lined up with each other, and so you'd really only see one horn. But the point of this, the whole concept here, is that this is the most instructive possible view. They're shown in this combined or twisted perspective as a way to give us the most possible information about the animal. Another image here from Lascaux. One of the things that's kind of interesting here is you can see how the natural formations of the cave are often utilized to advantage in order to help kind of give you the idea, the concept of the form or shape of the animal. In this next image here, you can see an image that of an animal on a baseline, which is of course kind of standard for Lascaux, but directly above it there's some kind of interesting markings. And these have raised a lot of questions. We don't really know exactly what they're about, but we find markings like this in some of these upper Paleolithic period caves. And some people have postulated or theorized that they may be some sort of communication, a clan symbol or something that communicates a more complex or deeper concept. So not quite far enough to say written language yet, but it may be symbolic of some specific idea. Now, one of the most unusual and most complicated to decipher images from Lascaux is the image we're looking at here, the wounded man and disemboweled bison. So this could, in fact, and we don't really know for sure, but this could, in fact, be the earliest known example of a narrative anywhere in the world. This dates somewhere between 15,000 and 13,000 BCE, and this could be representing here a narrative, a story, a communication regarding an event. We have a bison here which has been disemboweled. You can see the intestines hanging out, an image that maybe represents a spear, and an image that represents possibly a man falling over onto his back. This could be a hunt gone wrong. We don't really know. There's a lot of other symbols here. We have this bird image on the end of a staff, which some people have postulated may represent a shaman, some sort of shamanistic imagery. And another question, of course, is the rhinoceros on the left involved? Is he somehow part of this story? We don't really know. And these could be completely unrelated images, but there's certainly a good chance here that what we're looking at is one of the earliest known examples of storytelling. So another example here of a vocabulary term for you is contour line. A contour line essentially refers to a continuous line defining the outer shape of an object. And we can see here, if you look at this image of this bull from Lascaux, that it is drawn essentially in contour. Now, there are others which are drawn and painted in more of a modeled fashion, where you actually have them completely filled in and shaded. You can see kind of the shadow of an earlier one that's down to the lower edge here of this bull. But many of the images are done in this style using a contour line. So following here are a few additional images from Lascaux, also from Chauvet Cave, showing some additional examples of Paleolithic cave painting and some of the wide variety that we see within these sites. So in addition to sites in Europe and Africa, we also do see examples of Paleolithic art in the New World. So this example here is a Camelid Sacrum. Now some of you might be wondering, what is a Camelid Sacrum? Well, it's a bone, basically part of a camelid, and a camelid basically is a llama or an alpaca. And this has been carved and created and modified, if you will, into this image, this representation of a canine or a dog. So this example comes from a town that was inhabited somewhere around 35,000 BCE originally. And this object itself, though, comes a little later from that town's history, again, somewhere around 14,000 to 7,000 BCE. But this place had been inhabited by people who had crossed over the Bering Strait from Asia and migrated across the land bridge. And these people were nomadic. They hunted large animals such as mammoths. They were hunter-gatherers, essentially. And evidence at the site kind of gives us some ideas about what their lifestyle was like. And it was carved, again, into this form out of a piece of bone from some sort of animal, probably, again, an alpaca or a llama. So this place was really a pretty fertile place to settle. There was rivers and springs and apparently quite a bit of food. They engaged in some limited agriculture and also eventually breeding of animals. And of course, this eventually turns into a Neolithic culture. And then this is really, of course, where we see eventually the evolution of the cultures such as the Aztecs and others that come from this part of the world. This example is referred to as the Running Horned Woman from Tasali in Niger, from Algeria, dating roughly to about 6,000 to 4,000 BCE. And it's painted, it's pigment on rock. And this has a much more well-defined human form than we have ever seen with examples of Paleolithic art. With Paleolithic art, it's really quite common to see examples of animals, but people are quite rare. And so this one is really quite remarkable in the level of detail and sophistication with which it is rendered. This example, again, from Algeria shows us an image of a woman who may be in some sort of ceremonial context. We can see the horns here. Also, the dots may represent some other important concepts or symbols. But again, what's really truly remarkable about this, the most important concept about this, one of the reasons this is a key work, is because it's a cave painting of a human, and one that's really quite sophisticated in terms of representation. And again, earlier examples, most examples really, of Paleolithic art focus on animals. And this is probably because the animals are the primary food source. But this is really a remarkable image on a lot of levels.